Good afternoon, boa tarde. Sunday was indeed a happy day for Brazil, for democracy, and for the planet. Bem-vindos e bem-vindas. Welcome to this post-election discussion as Brazil remains on the edge and we ponder over the future of the world's fourth largest and quite fractured democracy. My name is João Biehl. I am professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology here at Princeton University, where I also direct the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, which is hosting this event. We are grateful to the Program in Latin American Studies and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese for their co-sponsorship. The creation of the Brazil Lab 4 years ago coincided with the presidential election of Jair Bolsonaro. Since then, a lot of our attention and energy has been directed to both denouncing this authoritarian turn and the dismantling of protection systems of all kinds, as well as to harnessing alternative forms of evidence and mobilization and look towards questions of social and environmental justice. And we want the Brazil Lab to remain a space to think through and with Brazil and Brazilians, but looking forwards towards a better, more just future. Brazilians should be proud, indeed proud, of have democratically removed an autocrat from office. We all know that the longer they stay on power, the more they dismantle democracy, curtail social rights, and entrench domination and harm. While Lula won a tense and tight race with less than 51% of the general vote, Bolsonaro and his ultra-conservative agenda made significant inroads in Congress and has given no sign of letting down on political polarization strategies. One wonders then about the alliances and compromises that Lula will have to make to be able to govern, and the outreach and communication strategies necessary to try to repair the body politic. What will be the policy priorities of the new government amid mounting economic, social, and environmental catastrophes? And what does Lula's election represent for the continent, the US, and for planetary causes? We have the great honor and pleasure to have Ilona Szabó, Patrícia Campos Mello, and Brian Winter with us today. They are three absolutely brilliant and wonderfully engaged public intellectuals and great friends of the Brazil Lab, and they will help us probe the significance of Lula's victory and reflect on political futurity. Ilona Szabó is a human rights and international studies scholar, a globally recognized civic entrepreneur. Ilona is the co-founder and executive director of Igarapé, a leading think and do tank on security, climate, and development issues in the global South. Ilona is a member of the high-level advisory board of the United Nations Secretary General. She is the author of A Defesa do Espaço Cívico, in defense of civic space, and Drogas, as Histórias que não te contam, Drugs, the Untold Stories, among other books. Patrícia Campos Mello is an award-winning investigative journalist and editor-at-large at Folha de São Paulo, Brazil's premier daily newspaper. Patrícia is widely known for her fierce reporting on fake news and illegal use of mass messaging to influence public opinion. Patrícia is the author of the book A Máquina de Ódio, The Hate Machine. She's currently a research fellow at Columbia University. And last but not least, Brian Winter is the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly and one of Latin America's most influential political analysts. He lived in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico as a correspondent for Reuters before taking on his current role in New York, where he's also the vice president of Policy for the Americas Society and Council of the Americas. He's the author of several books, including The Accidental President of Brazil. This is our format today. Ilona, Patrícia, in this order, will speak for about 7 minutes each, and then we'll engage in a brief back and forth. For the audience watching from home, great to have you here with us. The chat on our YouTube channel is open, so please feel free to ask questions as the event unfolds. Our team will be collecting your questions and will forward them to me. I will pass them on to our speakers. We will wrap up the discussion around 5:45 p.m. So thank you all for being with us today. Ilona, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, João, Miqueias. It's a wonderful opportunity and an excellent time also to commemorate democracy with Brian, Patrícia, and among people that have been worried and have been working for democracy. So I think the first thing that you already said, and I think we need to reiterate, that this was the democracy's victory, not only for Brazil, but for the world, because as the fourth largest democracy, if we had a second term of a leader with authoritarian populist traits, and that already had damaged so much the institutional and, let's say, the societal tissue in Brazil, we could see, you know, a trend that would definitely go into a more autocratic ruling and influencing, unfortunately, other people with the same traits worldwide. So democracy won. And this was not an election about, I say this many times, because of course we have to recognize a lot of people are unhappy. The country is really divided. But this was also an election about the future generations, the right to the future. Because if this government, was re-elected, we know also that possibly we would get much closer to an Amazon forest tipping point, deterioration of other biomes, and Brazil hosts the majority of the largest tropical forest in the world. So this is also the right to the future that is preserved. And so a lot of, let's say, responsibility also for the next leader to keep that in mind. He came to power with also the mission to just make this equation to work, development and standing nature, as we say today, nature positive. We have to really halt the devastation of our biomes and our biodiversity. So to start, a few challenges, because as you already pinpointed, and I think Patrícia will talk very much about that, we are seeing a division that we've never seen before. And again, this is not only in Brazil. And this is happening at a time where we see systemic risks, systemic crisis, compounded crises worldwide, started with the pandemics and just deepened inequalities that many countries in the developing world, including Brazil, are still trying to improve, just to diminish the gaps, issues of supply chain and of geopolitical moves. Then we also seen during this period the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and now I think including today an elevated threat of a nuclear nuclear arms use, which would be catastrophic. So we have also the energy supply crisis, and what this will also talk to the latest and I think the most important crisis of our times, which is the climate crisis. So this government comes into place at a time that Brazil was out of most of the multilateral tables that were discussing and making the decisions about all these issues that are fundamental for our future, fundamental for the developing world. So in a time of division, in a time of lack of trust in institutions, in politicians, at a time also where civic space was severely curtailed in many democracies. And of course, in Brazil, this was a major problem since day zero from this government, since really even before the election, when the results were coming. We already knew the rhetoric was absolutely against civil society, very, very strong against independent media, and just a very, let's say, we knew in 2018 that we would have 4 very difficult years, and they were just confirmed. So we need immediately to go back to the table. And I think that's an important message. So what to expect for the transition, I think still a very big challenge. This election was also a very violent one in terms of polarization, misinformation, and I'll leave that for Patrícia, but also of political violence. This was a dangerous moment where there were conflicts that led including to like deaths of supporters of one side or the other, but very much led by the far right in terms of the escalation of the use of force. And we're at a time where many institutions that will be absolutely needed to deal with the major, let's say, the needs of the people today are dismantled. So federal institutions are weakened, and we're going to have also to look into that in a very, very quick way. So in my field, I see one major challenge as the politicization of the police forces. So we saw during the election day that the federal road police was used to try to block, to delay people from getting to vote, a very, very unexpected way of using this police force in election day in specific country areas of the country. So that was also something that, let's say, we were not caught by surprise, but just proves that there will be a long way to pacifying a country of the size and of this division as Brazil is. And I cannot not say we have a major urgent crisis of hunger. So during this government, we got 33 million people hungry again at a country that was already a leading one in eradicating extreme poverty, in putting people, including people, at least in a level of not food insecurity that today we are back to, which is a shame. Since we are a breadbasket, we are a major food production country. So this is unacceptable. So, but let's say plenty of challenges, but I am very optimistic, and I have to say I have to be, because we have no time to spare. We have no time to waste. So I think there are major opportunities, and I'll tell why. So Brazil can be and should be the green developing world power, and that would actually, if we focus on that, we could be a green developed power. And why I say that? Because not only we have this amount of natural resources that, if sustainably used, could be honestly the, let's say, the new way of the first, my dream is that we can find our way to be the first forested developed country. And when I say forested, it's not, let's say, monoculture. I'm talking reaching biodiversity, in preservation of species, in really using this with all the potential for bioeconomy, biotech, for carbon markets, for inclusion of indigenous people. So there is a huge opportunity for nature-based solutions, but also Brazil can lead the way for the South into the green transition. We can be a leading renewable energy power. We already have a very clean energy matrix, and that's something that I think the developing world needs to catch this train as well. And as well, we are a major food security, let's say, power, and how to do that more sustainably. We have so much land that is degraded. There's so many techniques that are emerging that could help us also to produce food, like feed Brazil and the world more sustainably. And we already in our international cooperation were historically exporting these techniques, so we can help ourselves in the world also in this leapfrog into sustainable food production. Brazil can just also help to bring some leadership back to the world, because we do need good leadership, multilateral leadership, responsible leadership. And I think we cannot forget that we have a civil society that is hungry to sit back at the table. So we also hope and will work towards having that, again, a multi-sectoral approach to problem solving, to improve of public policies. And more than ever, we're going to need civil society. Of course, the government will lead, but we'll also need the private sector in Brazil to join forces onto solving our collective challenges. So I'll stop here to listen to my colleagues, but I'm relieved. I'm optimistic. I know the challenges are immense, but I think we have a lot of people that are willing to join forces and contribute, and we cannot miss this opportunity. We are given the opportunity to solve these major problems and to contribute not only to Brazil, but to a world that is really lacking positive leadership. And I believe that we can start bringing that back. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Ilona, for just starting us on that, like a purge from which we could, start to imagine an horizon, and then hopefully to think an horizon, and hopefully work towards a different horizon. Really, thanks so much for all you do, Ilona, and for those impactful initial thoughts. So, Patrícia.
Well, first I wanted to thank you so much for the invitation and being here next to such esteemed friends, colleagues. It's really an honor. And I would like to apologize because I have the post-election coverage code. So please excuse my voice. I think I'm going to focus on the disinformation scenario that we saw. As you all know, in the US, some polls point out that over 60% of Republicans still believe that the election, the 2020 presidential election, was rigged. And I think that's what President Bolsonaro is aiming for in terms of maintaining the mobilization of his supporters. What we are seeing now, we are seeing an attempt to keep this radical base mobilized. And I'm not sure if you have been following TV or the videos today from the protests around the country. It's interesting when we start thinking, okay, this is a fringe movement, this is, just radical. It's a lot of people. It's really, and this is something that it's going to be a very powerful opposition to future and former President Lula in terms of popular pressure. On top of Congress, which is the most conservative Congress that we've had in many, many years, even though we could argue that some of the conservative legislators are not really conservative or more pragmatic. And this is something that gives President Lula some space to maneuver. But what I wanted to, we were learning this new aspects, the new aspects of disinformation and political disinformation in Brazil as the election, as we were following the election developments. In 2018 in Brazil, we had this epiphany in terms of the strength of this political disinformation and attempts to influence electoral public opinion and the electoral debate, and mainly through WhatsApp, messaging apps and Facebook. And of course, there was a very positive, a very comfortable situation for that kind of message to spread, because we had the same party in power for years among corruption scandals. So there was a popular discontent with the then current government. It was President Temer, but before that, and then you had the power, the strength of disinformation to sort of accelerate the dissemination of this. But I always like to say that we cannot blame technology alone. There was no technology that is responsible for electing anyone. It just potentializes some trends that are already there. Then in 2022, I think maybe a few countries in the world were watching Brazil closely, because it tells a lot about the future of the extreme right in the world, and the future and the new aspects of disinformation and political disinformation, which we are also going to see, and we have been seeing during the campaign for the midterms in the US. And what we saw in Brazil is that disinformation now, it's so much more complex and sophisticated than it was before. We don't have, it's not just social media, it's a huge ecosystem of junk news sites. Thousands or hundreds of not thousands, hundreds of websites that keep on popping up and pretend to be news organizations, but are really not. And they're spreading either propaganda or disinformation. And they are in turn disseminated and shared by political figures and influencers through messaging apps, through groups, and through social media accounts. So it basically, and also TVs that are supportive, like mainstream media that goes on to support the government and support the disinformative messages, and also the strength of YouTube and video. that all poses a lot of challenges for electoral legislation, for instance, because in Brazil, we have several, we've had legislation trying to regulate media and the political communication during electoral campaigns, but that does not apply to internet or social media or YouTube. So we've had some interesting experiences here in terms of in regular TV and radio in Brazil, you need to have like an equal balanced coverage of different candidates during electoral campaign. But those rules do not apply to YouTube. And when you have, some channels on YouTube that reach way more people than TVs, and you can have a specific channel just being used for defamation, propaganda, 24 hours a day, what do you do about this? So on the one hand, we had this, and on the other hand, we had this very complex ecosystem of websites that are integrated with the influencers and the profiles. So it's a much more powerful network of disinformation. The one thing that changed, I think, is, I'm going back, sorry. And the other thing that was much more powerful than in the previous presidential election is that, as you guys had in 2020, we had this overarching narrative of the fraudulent vote, rigged election that was being, disseminated by the president himself and his supporters. So it was a very strong message. So on the one hand, we had this very complex and more sophisticated and effective disinformation ecosystem. And on the other hand, we had authorities trying to keep up with the new aspects of political communication and disinformation. So we had our Superior Electoral Court basically legislating and creating legislation to try to curb disinformation and to try to, make up for, we don't really know how to legislate this new universe of political communication. And then, of course, you had some abuses by the electoral courts, which in turn fueled more disinformation narratives about censorship, and also some censorship concerns are legitimate. So very, very interesting problems arising from this new, very complex ecosystem of disinformation and how to legislate over that. And then there's a positive aspect that civil society and just regular people were more aware of, the attempts to, manufacture consensus or influence people or just spread conspiracy theories, which does not mean that they're not still open to those theories, because of course, they were spreading like crazy. One of the things that we were very surprised is that in the beginning, for the first round, the main type of disinformation was basically, voting machines are not trustworthy, you can't audit them. And then on the second round, you had progressives joining the disinformation wagon with the religion stuff, culture wars, this really decades old strategy of defamation, of saying, you were even like, you worship the devil. I mean, this really, so we had this. So these two combined, and the fact that the left, and let me not make any kind of, how can I say this, false equivalence here. Of course, the right is decades ahead of the left, at least in Brazil, in understanding and creating new strategies of political disinformation. But part of the left did join those efforts and feeling as if, we don't have other options, we need to use the same weapons. And that also creates new questions in terms of how do we regulate that so that not every single politician feels that they have incentives to engage in disinformation, otherwise they are no longer competitive. So these are some of the questions that we are dealing with now. And as we were discussing, of course, right now we have protests all around the country and a gazillion Telegram and WhatsApp groups with the most, absurd conspiracy theories going on. And basically this machine of raising money and having people protest and putting pressure on legislators. And this is going to go on as a permanent electoral campaign, I think, for the next 4 years, which is going to be a challenge. And again, it's what you guys have been living for the last 2 years. So I wasn't very organized in my ideas, so I really apologize, but I think these are some of the things that we're still trying to grasp right after the election. And thank you.
No, thank you so much, Patrícia, for your very sobering, you gave us an incredible analytic at various scales, but you landed in this sobering picture of the continuation of this machine, right? And how somehow Bolsonarismo somehow will continue through those various ecosystems and campaigns, and how the political field has been hijacked to a certain way. And then the question is, how do you recuperate a different way of engaging the political, if not through that? It's quite sobering and challenging. And I think that Brian might have some thoughts about that as well. So Brian, the screen is yours. Thank you, Patrícia. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, boa tarde, good afternoon. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel with two friends and intellectuals whom I admire very much, and I'm grateful to Princeton for the invitation. I also will do my best today because eu não sei vocês, mas eu estou cansado, and you can probably see the circles under my eyes here. I almost considered asking a colleague here for some makeup to try to cover them up a little bit, but it's been a long couple of days. I opted not to do that, just for the record. But I do think that, as João said, I think that Sunday was, for the most part, a success story for Brazilian democracy, especially by the standards of our time and the moment that the United States and Brazil and so much of the Western world is going through, which is a moment where democracies are under pressure and in many cases in retreat. And for the country to come out of it as well as it did, I think was admirable and important and generated surprise here. And I'm going to try to make some comments about why I think that happened. And I would just point to 5 reasons why I think that, again, we're not out of the woods yet. These protests that are happening in Brazil today are important and worth watching. But following the president's comments yesterday, that was as close as we were ever going to see from Jair Bolsonaro to a white flag. It does seem that the transition is going to go ahead as planned. And I was one of many people who spent the last more than a year concerned that there would be some sort of institutional crisis in the event of a loss by President Bolsonaro. So I think that before we look ahead to what the challenges will be for Lula, and I think they'll be immense, I think it is worth briefly considering how we got over this hump on Sunday, because I think that there are lessons there not only for Brazil, but also for the United States and perhaps other countries around the world that are facing similar pressures. So I said 5 reasons. I think the first one has to do with Brazil's electronic voting system, which, President Bolsonaro spent so much time and effort trying to discredit in the eyes of his supporters, not just his supporters, but recall that he brought in the entire, not the entire, but a huge portion of the diplomatic corps in Brasilia back in July and presented them with a 45-minute PowerPoint in an effort to convince them also that there were flaws in the system. And the system ended up working as well as it always has. And I have, of course, I live here in New York and have many friends who follow Brazilian politics, including people who, by the way, had never shown any interest in Brazilian politics before. But I think everybody, certainly in the United States, understood what the stakes were in this election because there were so many parallels with the experience that we had in 2020. And one thing that many friends could not believe was they could not believe that by 8 o'clock Eastern time on Sunday night, all the votes were counted. They were like, what do you mean? How do they already know the result? And it's even more extraordinary when you consider that Brazil is a country that is bigger than the continental United States and involves some very, distant places in the Amazon and so on. And the fact that all these votes were counted was I mean, not exactly a miracle. Maybe it's not that hard to do, but it's not something we've been able to do here in the US. And I think that's important because it prevented in practice the questioning and the intrigue and the suspense that there was here in not just in 2020, but in 2016 and certainly back in 2000. And it shows that having a good system that can tabulate votes quickly is actually really key to protecting democracy, because it leaves challengers without as many possible windows to create both sort of their narrative with their supporters as well as kind of other shenanigans. Related to that, the second thing that I think was important was the broad effort by Brazil's institutions to ensure that the result was respected. And after that quick result came in, the statement by Arthur Lira, the president of the House of Deputies, the equivalent of the US Speaker of the House, and Lira, of course, had been a strong Bolsonaro ally, puts out this incredibly detailed, strongly worded statement within, I think, an hour or two of the result, saying that he recognized the result and that the popular will, as reflected in the ballot box, cannot be contested. And from what I've read in the Brazilian press and also heard from sources that are part of the Bolsonaro world, and I do talk to everybody, at least everybody will talk to me. That statement from Lira was the end. That was the moment when Bolsonaro and his team began to understand that there was no exit from this result. But Lira was not the only one. The business community had been instrumental both behind the scenes as well as in the letter that they published, I think 2 or 3 months before Election Day, in which they stated their strong, unambiguous support for Brazilian democracy. The Supreme Court also did its part. So I think that at the end of the day, it was, at least at some level, reflects the success and the importance of democracy to a large part of institutional democratic Brazil. The third factor, I think, was the international community. There was a coordinated effort over the course of many months between European governments, the Biden administration, and others around the world, where it was agreed that they would issue a statement or statements endorsing the winner, whoever it was, once the result became public. And I think the Biden administration in particular deserves some credit for having really taken a balanced approach to President Bolsonaro over the last 2 years. It would have been very easy to fall into a war of words with Bolsonaro, given, for example, Bolsonaro waiting longer than any other leader in the world, except for possibly Kim Jong-un, to recognize President Biden's victory back in 2020. But that probably, a war of words probably would have benefited Bolsonaro more than it would have benefited the US position. And I think this government understood that, and they very wisely stayed out of it while continuing to maintain a positive economic and strategic relationship with Brazil on many levels at the same time. There were also contacts behind the scenes involving people like the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin with the Brazilian military that many believe helped dissuade. We'll never know how necessary it was, but many believed helped dissuade the Brazilian military from embarking on any kind of anti-democratic adventure with the president. So I think that was important. The fourth thing that I think led Bolsonaro to, at least at some level, accept the result was paradoxically the strength of conservatives in the election. His brand of conservative thought did very well, even though he lost. And here I would engage in a bit of self-criticism. I was one of many people who said over the course of months that the closer the result on election day, the greater the likelihood of a Brazilian January 6th. And I think now, watching and thinking about how everything turned out, I think the opposite actually turned out to be true. The fact that these conservative candidates, these Bolsonarista candidates, did so well And that so many, I think all of his ex-ministers who ran for public office won their elections and will occupy very important positions in the Senate. Bolsonaro allies will be in charge. They'll be governors of the three most populous states in Brazil. Of course, that's Sao Paulo, Minas, and Rio de Janeiro. And I know it's been reported, and I've certainly heard that many of these people who won elections were the ones who were pleading most loudly for President Bolsonaro over the last 72 hours to come out in public and acknowledge the result, because they were worried that if they failed to do that, that it could put the achievements of the movement as a whole in danger. And so I think that their efforts were also part of the story. So that's four. That leaves one. And, you know, really the fifth thing that I think was fundamental to Brazilian democracy, having, at least for the moment, you know, gotten past this window of great risk. The fifth factor was the fact that January 6th happened. What I mean by that is what happened here in the United States on January 6th, but also in the weeks beforehand, illustrated to any doubters that democracy, even in places where it's stable, can be put at risk by leaders who question voting systems and who might seek to overturn the result. It was not a theoretical thing. I think it laid out in pure black and white terms that, you know, even in the world's oldest modern democracy, that this sort of thing was possible. In the States, and I think this will be true in Brazil, as Patrícia was saying, even though it didn't succeed, it will leave scars, but it could have been worse. So I think the fact that, you know, we went through this trauma here in the United States, it does serve as an example. And I've heard, you know, people say that it was a blueprint for Bolsonaro, but I think it was also a cautionary tale for other actors, other institutions, other interests that worked in the months prior to the election to make sure that nothing similar would happen. So again, we're not quite out of the woods yet, but I think it's important to pause and celebrate at least, you know, the achievements of and the maturity of Brazilian democracy so far, because it's not something that we should take for granted. So, and I think there are lessons there for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That's so, you know, it's so incredibly helpful, and to get your perspective, your comparative perspective as well. And I wonder if Ilona, Patrícia, Brian, if you have questions to each other, you want to comment on what you spoke. Patrícia, you go.
No, I just, yes, I agree with Brian. And I think what's interesting is the way President Bolsonaro made the concession speech. It was ambiguous enough for him to keep his supporters mobilized. But at the same time, once he sends his chief of staff, the Ministro da Casa Civil, Ciro Nogueira, to say, you know, let the transition begin, he's actually respecting the Constitution, right? So I think he's going to play with ambiguity a lot to keep, you know, this mobilization going on. And the one question that I have, maybe Ilona or Brian or even you, João, might help. Do you think we're going to have a big lie caucus in Brazil, just the way you guys have in the US? Or is it because we have a lot of Bolsonaristas who were elected, but to what extent they're going to be, you know, really insisting on there was no justice in the way the electoral process, which is, I'm not sure, is that going to be a mobilizing force, this resentment sort of?
Ilona?
Right, maybe Brian want to go first. I honestly don't think so, just given also the differences between the US and Brazil. I think in terms of even legislation, we have legislation to curb what is happening now. For example, what you know, the Congresswoman Carla Zambelli profiles. There is a lot of, we can discuss if they're being too strict or not, but there is legislation that supports Minister Alexandre de Moraes' very strict measures against you know, certain types of speeches and acts by politicians. I honestly also don't think the Bolsonaristas raiz, as we call the very ones that are, let's say, the loyalists to the president are the majority of those elected under the agenda that he supported. We see this. I mean, it's very telling that Brian already mentioned that the three governors that were elected under his platform in three major states in Brazil immediately put the police to unblock the roads in Brazil of the truck convoy. So, I mean, that's telling. They're saying, okay, like we needed also to surf the wave of Bolsonarism, as we say in Brazil, to win the election. But we are not crazy. We have rules, we have a constitution, and we want to be able to govern. So what I hope is that we actually have a responsible right in Brazil that detaches from the far right in Brazil. And then we are going to see, honestly, the size of this far right, because like right now, we got the right and the far right in this election kind of siding. And this detachment, and I mean, and to be also very fair, part of the right came into the middle because they were really concerned with democracy and did not vote for Bolsonaro. So what's the size of the right? What's the size of the far right? Who is the center? Maybe this will be clearer. Maybe I'm hoping too much, but I don't think we will have the extent of like a far right taking over Congress, like the same impact that the Republicans have today. Let's say that the more moderate right has less voice. That's my take. But Brian, you know more about your country there. I'd love to hear your perspective.
I just wanted to clarify my question. I don't mean that they're gonna dispute results, or it's just to be the mobilizing theme, the whole, and that's what I wanted to know your opinion.
So Brian, before you kick in, so it's interesting, I would connect with that question that already came from our own Miqueias Mugi, which is, he was saying, Brian, we tend to think of the elected autocrats as creating textbooks around the world that travel. So there were a lot have been made about the Trump textbook, etc. But like, do you see any quote unquote innovation coming from the Brazilian far right? And I think that blends with this question that Ilona was raising as well, the extent to which, or to the question Patrícia was asking, to the extent to which it can actually congeal as a political mobilizing force.
What a great question that is. Let me just talk for just a moment about the previous topic. I think that there will always be holdouts, and many of them are on the streets in Brazilian cities today. And some of this is a product of social media and the fact that it's possible to live in these bubbles with a totally different set of facts and a totally different reality. I was struck by video that I saw today that ostensibly it was a big crowd of people out protesting that started celebrating and dropping to their knees in tears and crying because they saw on WhatsApp that Alexandre de Moraes, the president of the Electoral Court, had been arrested. Of course, he hadn't, but that was what they saw, and the whole crowd just erupts in celebration. And the video didn't show what it looked like when they found out later. I assume at some point that it wasn't true. So, there will always be those voices, but I have to say, I was struck by the number of actors in Brazilian society, including on the right, who embraced the result. And the one that really, there were two that really kind of blew me away. One was just, again, the immediacy of that statement from Arthur Lira, showing a courage that very few Republicans had here in the United States at that moment. Many of them were saying it kind of in hushed tones, but not like that. But the one that really got me was Silas Malafaia, the evangelical pastor who is so close to Bolsonaro that he accompanied Bolsonaro to Queen Elizabeth's funeral. And if I'm not mistaken, on the day of the election, he gives an interview to Patrícia's paper, to Folha, where he says, and I've got it open here, kind of a rough translation. He says, the sovereign will of the people has been established. And then he said, if Bolsonaro wants to contest the results, they're going to have to present very robust proof. And he says, I won't go on an adventure with anyone without proof. there was stealing. Well, then prove it. And this was, I mean, this was very sort of unambiguous and very strong. And I was trying to really think about this today. And, you know, I wonder how much of the story is the fragmentation of Brazil's political party system, where, you know, which so many people have pointed to over in this case, maybe it prevents too much power from being consolidated in just one figure. We've heard over the last couple of years that, you know, Donald Trump has effectively taken over the Republican Party. And I think that's, I mean, that's largely because that's what the voters of that party want. But there is a structural or institutional element to that somebody like Arthur Lira, who's allied to the president but not part of his party, doesn't have to toe the exact line on everything the president says, and can get away with that without fear of losing his job in the way that he might if, you know, there was just a two-party system in Brazil. So we'll see. I mean, which is all a way of saying I remain encouraged. There were also people in the Bolsonarista media space, like you know, Rodrigo Constantino, who well, I'm sure everyone here on this call is aware of him, was on social media yesterday saying pretty much, hey guys, like, we have to accept this result. This is it. I know he said some different things today. I watch him quite closely, but the point is I saw a much quicker acceptance from actors who you wouldn't necessarily expect to get on board with the result than we did here in the States. So the question of innovation from the far right, that is such a great question. I'm a little bit stumped, frankly. I mean, Ilona, Patrícia, what do you think? I have to say, I mean, we were joking before we came on stage. I am constantly, as an American who follows Brazil for a living, questioning whether the parallels between the US and Brazil, like how useful they are, and at what point do they stop? And usually over the last 2 years or 4 years, the answer has been no, they're pretty useful. But there are some things that Bolsonaro, I'm sure, has done differently that represent, at least for that cause, an advance. But I'd have to think about it a bit more.
Well, just a very quick comment on that. I think, you know, because I was an active actor in a 2005 referendum that we had on gun control in Brazil, where for the first time I saw what was the power of the Brazil importing. At that time was the NRA playbook, but the NRA playbook, including the symbols, including the arguments, including the aesthetics of the movement, is pretty much what was embraced by Bolsonaro till today. So it just got better and improved with Cambridge Analytica kind of methods and information. But I can say that with the twists of having to adapt the language to Brazil, but I can say that the far right really drinks from the fountain of the US far right movement, and that I see in the country for, you know, over all this period that I followed the movement, starting with the gun lobby, then with the, you know, the whole Tea Party, Steve Bannon, and so on. What I think it's different, as you're saying, Brian, is that we are much more diverse and plural society maybe than the US. The divisions exist I would say we have so many divisions, and Brazil has this, let's say, it's not even, we have to be very careful with what we say these days, not to pass the wrong message, but we say that we are a melting pot because there are other cultures that have people from all over, but they don't mingle, they don't kind of get together. Brazil somehow has syncretism in religion, in cultures, and so on. So at the same time that we recognize the differences, we can also recognize that we are kind of similar in many fronts. But just to say, and I'm not going to go further in the argument that I wanted, because it's going to be politically tricky. So I apologize not to be very clear here, but I understand that I don't want to also offend, not at a second, the the part of the electorate that chose Bolsonaro, because I really think we need to build bridges at the moment. So I'm not going to say things that are sensitive here, but just to say, I do believe we follow a lot the US in terms of the far right. I don't think the majority of the people that voted for the president are there, but I do think that while the far right continues to thrive in places like the US, it's a threat also to Brazil. So we have to think of ways then globally to de-radicalize. Because I was talking to people today and they're saying that the protesters there on the street, some of them, they're believing in things like, looks like they're tortured mentally because they've been brainwashed to believe in a totally parallel reality. And they need help. How do we help these people back into a world of common sense, of facts, of dialogue, and not of fear of the other? Because I think this is a job we have to do in Brazil, in the US, and in many other countries that are facing this extreme division and polarization boosted by false news, boosted by disinformation, and of course, the algorithm, let's say, expansion and kind of a possibility of this intensity of these messages all over again.
Mm-hmm. You know, if I can just jump in here, I was just provoked by Patrícia saying maybe to jump into the conversation and this very provocative question of the innovation of Brazil's far right and following the interventions by Brian and Ilona. I was reminded of Brazilian political scientist Marcos Nobre. On the night of the election in Fora de Teresina Live, he said it different than the US, where you don't have those established political parties. In Brazil, you have this fragmentation. But in Brazil, he was making a case that autocracy worked at a very personal level. It's adjudicated by I vis-a-vis the other. So there's something that every person becomes the one who really judges the other, you know. And I think it goes along the line of what Ilona was saying. How then can you, and he was saying Lula will have to win back 20-25% of the people who voted, because maybe they are not Bolsonaristas raiz, you know, like entrenched loyalists. But for some reason, they were brought into that, and they bought that kind of worldview or way of assessing others' values, perspectives for themselves, right? And I think, Patrícia, many people, we have a very lively group participating with questions. And I think Carlos Fausto and many others ask, what can PT do? What can the Workers' Party do? What can a Lula government do on that front, since they didn't have a clear social media strategy, right? It has to pass through communications, right? They're all talking about that. There must be a strategy of communication here in this new ecosystem that it's ever more complex, right? And gets even more complex if you think it's not necessarily mediated by dualistic, you know, political parties, you know, so to speak. So how to cope with the predominance, far-right predominance in the social media without becoming like them, right? So that's one set of questions. For Ilona, many people were asking about the question of security that you brought up, the police you mentioned, right? The federal police. What about the military? Where are the military now? So what are the challenges, given that the military are so embedded in government right now, right? And I think for Brian, many people were interested in hearing from you, what are some next steps of the Biden administration? You mentioned some previous steps that were important, you know, for this hopefully peaceful transition to happen, right? Acceptance of the electoral results. Where do you see the Biden administration going? And that somehow resonates with a question also for Ilona, where she signaled how Brazil could become a global environmental leader, right? Forested developed country, right? So what are some of the possibilities that you see emerging, vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis the United States on that front? So that's first an initial bundle for you guys. Patrícia, do you want to get started?
Sure. I just wanted to add to what Ilona and Brian were saying. I think maybe a big difference is that in our coalition presidentialism, the ways they have been using to convince other legislators from, so many other parties to support, there's a lot of money and corruption involved. So in that sense, we maybe not that the US does not have corruption, of course they have, but when we are thinking about, a Tea Party caucus, or, how many of the opposition legislators in Brazil are really ideological or conservative? My guess is not that many, right? So it might be easier to negotiate. And just for the environmental stuff, I just wanted to say that something that is is giving us a lot of hope, and I hope it really happens, is you have Marina Silva and so many other people together with Lula, and the idea, to use again environmental policy as a foreign policy, as the foreign policy main tool, and so this is very. So now, sorry, going back to your question. No one knows the answer to that. Everybody asks that, why does the left, why they don't know how to use social media or, internet communication more effectively? Some people say because, well, for instance, I can talk about PT. PT is very closed and very hierarchical. So there were some people who had, I'm not getting into the point of discussing, is this ethical? Is this not? We can get to that part, right? Because I don't buy yes, we don't do it because it's unethical. No, I think they didn't do it before because they didn't know how to do it. And then they slowly were learning. But the network propaganda is very decentralized, essentially. And this is something that in the Workers' Party, you have like one person who centralizes X, and then so it was very. There was the marketing specialist, the internet marketing specialist of Guilherme Boulos, who's a really young guy who was really amazing in the 2020 municipal election. Boulos started, from behind and ended up in the second round with Bruno Covas. He was brought into the campaign, but he was ostracized. No one would let him work. And even Janones, the deputy. Of course, I sort of understand, PT not wanting to incorporate him to the official campaign, and they were keeping him in the B side. But still, it took like months until they, okay, so let him do his stuff. So I think it is a big challenge, and a lot of it is about this very somehow hierarchical and authoritarian power structure inside some of the left-wing parties, and especially in PT, where you have like the older members of the party and the older legislators who have a lot of power. So it's a power struggle. So that might explain part of it, why they can't get the internet stuff right, because again, they did not get it right. By any means, this campaign.
Sure. Should I just go ahead, or Brian, do you want to jump in? Okay, so on that, I would totally agree with Patrícia, and I would add the challenge of the generation. So like the Workers' Party is a party that I don't think the older leaders understand this phenomena, and they will need to renew to deal not only with the digital domain, but with many other domains that are very much accelerated in technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. So this will be, let's say, a survival for the party and for the country in that sense, because it needs to speak to policies that are will have to use the digital transformation as a cross-cutting issue. And of course, that has many threats if not dealt in the right way. So I think this is a major point in terms of renewing generations in politics in Brazil. And that's for sure for the Workers' Party, especially a challenge that they have to face up front. So on police and military, so police, I'd say, I mean, there were very serious things that happened during this election period. And if we ignore the rules that were not followed, the let's say the misbehave that is totally unconstitutional, we will pay the price. So I think governors and the president, and then of course the appointed Minister of Justice, who have to deal with what happened, like say, especially in the Federal Road Police, but not only. We saw state police up in front also disrespecting orders, and I think governors should be encouraged also to deal with that. Why? Because in Brazil, both while we have a military police, agree or not, that's the code, we cannot accept that the ones in charge of law and order do not obey law and order. We cannot accept that. We can work to change. We can work to unite the police as it should be. In most of countries in the world, we don't have two polices, but we cannot accept that they don't follow the law. And so I think that's a very important point for governors and for the next Minister of Justice. And if we have a Minister of Public Security, because it's not clear yet if there will be a recreation of the Minister of Public Security. On the military side, I think there is a huge, immense challenge. And why? Because I would say very many of them, and not at all, were brought into the rhetoric that the Workers' Party was the evil. And more than being supporters of the president, they were countering the Workers' Party in what happened. So first, I do think that while, of course, we need a strong defense ministry, it has to be civil. We have to go back to a time that active military men do not hold political positions in Brazil. That's very important. And this government opened the door to very dangerous politicization of key institutions. And if the institutions are to be respected as they need to be respected, they have to follow also and their mandate and their role. So I think a depolitization, being that we don't want the amount of military men that we had in political positions that were I don't know, even countless. There was a time it was over 3,000 of them, then just grew. So we have to go back to a civil government with people that have the curriculum to be in the positions there. And guns and politics, this cannot be the norm, and I don't think it will be the norm. But that said, how do we then make the military feeling that they are also valued? Because this is something that under civil government valued in a democracy, by the way, because I think there's a very, very clear role for military, institutions under democratic governments, but they need to be listened. And I think the bridge is there is that we're going to have a defense minister, although a civil defense minister, not a military one, in my view, that is accepted and that it's legitimate for this dialogue. And I would say these will be very tricky, because I know there is a lot of resistance from the military, from many senior military, to sitting down in this government. But again, they are hierarchical, they follow rules. If they are respected as they will be, I think this will be built. But I don't think it's going to be easy. So the choice for defense minister, there is even the possibility of the defense minister being the vice president, who is someone that is not from the Workers' Party. That would help in that sense. And on the environmental question, I would say there are many entry points. So to start, we already had Norway and Germany saying that they would defreeze the Amazon fund. I can guarantee there is a lot of international cooperation, funds for the protection of the forest and the protection of indigenous and traditional populations, but we can go much beyond that. There is a very big need for what we call nature-based solutions in the climate run to just keep the world below the 1.5 temperature increase. So Brazil should also think very smartly of regenerating, of new food systems that also can capture carbon. And we are doing a lot of interesting small-scale projects at the moment that should be scaled up with federal and subnational policies aligned. We will have not only international cooperation, but a lot of blended finance mechanisms and international investors then coming if we de-risk the investments towards what we call a bioeconomy, biotechnology, sustainable tourism, environmental services, and so on. And on the other side, again, in the green transition, we have Brazil has a lot of rare earths and critical minerals. We have already an added advantage of having a clean energy matrix, much cleaner than many other countries. So we can actually leapfrog into being, if we wanted, 100% renewable in a short, not very short, but in a medium term. I believe that we should go in that direction. There will be, discussion on when to phase out oil, how's the role of gas in the green transition. There are big discussions there, but we can leapfrog into green hydrogen. We are already having a lot of investments in Brazil from foreign companies starting to buy potential of solar and wind generation to produce green hydrogen to export to Europe. Brazil has to think about how to do green hydrogen for ourselves as well at scale. So I think that, and on the third pillar, again, the food production, there are so many opportunities there, especially when we think the Workers' Party policy of small productions, to aggregate that also in a sustainable production way that also is environmental friendly. So if we align these three, to be honest, like it's the best pathway, and it's the only pathway if we want to leapfrog. And I just think that that has to be a key priority for Brazilians. So we make sure the government don't deviate from that.
Great, thank you, Ilona. Brian. To your mix, Brian, the other question that emerged, which goes like, how you see the financial markets reacting to the Lula election as well? Okay,
well, thank you. Left to my own devices, I would just ask a bunch of questions of Ilona and Patrícia, because I'm learning so much today. Let me talk a little bit, try to respond to the question about what the Biden administration wants. And I to be clear, I'm not speaking for them today. I do have dialogue with members of the administration. But I think that there's a desire to focus on the Amazon and on climate change and on the possibilities for this green economy, this sustainable economy that is so promising for Brazil. That plays into a number of domestic and international priorities that this administration has. I am personally somewhat optimistic about the possibilities for that, but realistic about what some of the challenges will be. And I know you guys are too, but I worry about the political consensus necessary for Lula to repeat the success story of reducing deforestation during his first presidency, which, by the way, I think is the most compelling argument that Lula's first government was just good government, was what happened in the Amazon. So much of the other things you can kind of point to, the commodities boom and good luck and kind of the wind blowing in his direction. But the most effective, most convincing argument that that was actually a government that had technical capacity, that had the ability to create political consensus and execute on the ground, was this reduction in deforestation that we saw during that period. Can it be repeated? I don't know, because the financial resources are going to be more scarce this time. And it's impossible to ignore that the regions where deforestation is happening were among the regions that voted most overwhelmingly for Bolsonaro in this election. And what that tells you, I think, among other things, is that the people in that region endorse the model of slash and burn, at least in many cases, that Bolsonaro was at the very least implicitly supporting. I think explicitly in some cases as well, it's clear. And so will the federal government under Lula be able to go into some of these areas with IBAMA inspectors and other things that are necessary for progress really to happen and impose its will? I don't know. You know, and this gets to the broader question that's relevant to the financial markets, and I think relevant to everyone here, which is, will Lula have the agility and the ability to understand the current moment and the fact that this Brazil is so much more conservative than the one that he presided over the first time? And, you know, I have a lot of confidence, or I should really say better, a lot of respect for Lula and for his abilities as a politician. And I think his speech on Sunday night demonstrated that he started by thanking God, and he ended by quoting Pope Francis and Jesus Christ. And I've watched Lula for a long time. I don't personally remember him giving a speech quite like that. But now, you know, the question is, who's going to be in the cabinet? Will he bring new faces? Will it just be the same faces from his previous government? I won't name names, but, you know, you look at some of the early media reports and it sounds like a lot of the same people that have been around the PT and those circles for 20 years or longer, with the exception, of course, of people like Geraldo Alckmin. So I think so much now is going to depend on Lula's personal ability to understand the moment and articulate the kind of political consensus necessary, but also, I think, even more important, potentially, the human resources that he will be able to bring to this government to be able to push that forward. And I don't know yet. I think it's too early to be optimistic. I have lots of questions about what that group of people is going to look like.
Yes, Patrícia? Yeah.
Can I just add something real quick? I read something that made me a bit optimistic, because I agree, Brian. I mean, all the names we've been hearing are just, you know, same old people. But I heard two names, Priscila Cruz, that is, what's the education? I forgot.
Todos pela Educação.
Todos pela Educação, and Neca Setúbal, that are going to be advising the transition to the education minister. And that, for PT standards, it's quite something, because that's not the, you know, pure Workers' Party line of education. So I thought that was encouraging. The same way I think we're all trying to understand, if we have Felipe Salto, who used to be the Secretary of Finance in the São Paulo state, and before that from the Independent Fiscal. I mean, we could have something like the first Lula's first administration, that you did have some people who are not entirely aligned with the old school left dogma, so to say.
You know, this fantastic comments. It's getting blending so many like scales, perspectives, you know, and temporalities as well, but also together with a very concrete sense of the challenges and how it passes through human resources, right? It passes through new, you know, political alliances as well. And so we are coming close to the end. And in this last round, you know, in your answers, you address some of the questions that our very engaged public was asking, and they passed through also agribusiness, evangelicals, right? So we did not necessarily name them, but they were lurking in the way Brian was answering in his final, was talking in his final set of remarks, you know. And then of course that there were many more questions for Patrícia as well, you know. Are there distinct publics, you know, that are more drawn into this information politics machine and are more mobilized differentially than others, you know? So there was that question. Also, how do evangelicals get mobilized, and how could they be demobilized, since they are such an important political force right now? So those are some of the questions. The other questions were also at the level of how to both monitor, but also redirect but one of our audience members called fascist energy that has been unleashed out there, right? And so many people are also coming into the conversation asking about the role of the judiciary, right? And many people are asking, do you see the judiciary might act differently now, or which new domains open up? Patrícia already brought up that question about the role of the judiciary in mediating and monitoring, this political disinformation. So people added a few more questions to you along the lines of the comments that you yourself made. And I wonder if we could just end, giving, the space back to Ilona, Patrícia, and Brian, a few, final thoughts, 30 seconds, 1 minute, we love hearing from you. And we also hope that the Brazil Lab can continue to be a forum in which we can keep thinking together, and also that you bring challenges from your own areas of intervention for us to wrestle with in academia, because we want to be able to have our pulse in the present, so to speak. So some final comments from our distinguished guests.
Well, thank you, João. Like many important things. So definitely we're going to have to continue. But I wanted to address Brian's question on deforestation, because, that's now it turns out the climate and security program, it's the biggest one in Igarapé. And that's the climate and environment is where my head and my heart are in the last years. And I really think that's a big challenge, and we need a lot of effort there. So I don't have any, doubt that this will be much more difficult than in the first Lula government to diminish deforestation. First, because it's a new dynamic. There are many new actors that entered the territory. There are very many illicit economies that we've been studying, and they are very profitable. But what I have to say that makes, I think, a total difference, that most people that are involved in the deforestation and the illicit economies are not benefiting, really are not. The Amazon has a very low human development index, very low education level, very low income level compared even to other places in Brazil. So we have to offer alternatives, and that would be, other areas that I work, like drug policy. It's the same. Like the people that are really involved in the dirty business are not rich. They're not part of the international criminal networks. So first, let's follow the money there as well, because as you're saying, and we studied that, most of what's happening, the damage is in the Amazon, but the whole of Brazil and many other places are involved in the destruction. We did this study, 25 out of the 27 states were involved in environmental crimes. So we do need to look at the big picture and see how to use new mechanisms of fighting this ecosystem of crime, because it's much more linked to different sorts of crimes, to allow deforestation to decrease. And we cannot ostracize, or we cannot be either conservation or development. So the challenge is to really put people at the same table, saying, while we have to ban deforestation, because we're going to have strong command and control, we need sustainable development. We need to develop an ecosystem of business that is compatible with the standing forest. And I think that's also the difference. There are many other things that are at play now that were not in the first, as we call PPC, the plan for command and control in the Amazon in the past. So I think far from being easy, but it's an imperative for Brazil to be back in the world that we diminish deforestation. So let's use the new also information and ways of fighting crime intelligently. It's not heavy guns that will solve, but we will need enforcement, and also without the dichotomy of either development or preservation. That has to come together. So magic has to play there. I'll be at COP27 and COP15. Know that the whole new government will be in both. So I'm very looking forward to meeting all these new actors, old actors, but very dear ones, to instill also new ideas and see how we we just make this magic to happen.
Thank you, Ilona. Thank you, Patrícia.
Well, first, yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm really happy that I learned so much from all of you today. And some of the questions are actually, I do not know the answers, which makes me more aware that, there's so many things that we need to understand, after thinking about 2 days, the question about the evangelicals, how to reach the evangelicals, and also some things that Ilona and Brian said in terms of how do you understand that the population is much more conservative than we expected. And we had so many administrations that were, in the end, social democrats. And there's like these people who were orphans, who were really, for them, it's essential family values and religion. And I think in the case of PT, it's not like you wake up one day and you say, okay, no, so now we need a strategy to reach the evangelical voters. As we saw, it does not work, right? And of course, if you don't have the leaders of the Pentecostal churches, it's also difficult. But I think in terms of thinking about how to unify the country, one of the things is first, not calling people who voted for Bolsonaro fascists, because a lot of them are not fascists. They're just, not being heard or understood, or there's only the anti-Workers' Party. So maybe if we changed our approach to, of course, there's a fringe, and it's a large fringe of people who are basically fascists, but most of the voters, just because, there's some of their needs and their concerns that are not being heard for the last, several years, and last, PSDB, PT. So maybe we should think about how do you speak to people who are really worried about family values and religion, and not just thinking, this is some this like unfashionable thing, why are you worried about this? This is sometimes we're very arrogant and condescending towards, and we just say, they're all fascists. So maybe, this is something I tell myself, try not to be judgmental. Part of these people, if we want to unify the country, we need to understand what they vote for, what are the issues that really matter for them. Of course, again, not the fanatic fringe, but most of those people. We don't have 58 million fanatics, I hope. So, yeah, that's.
Thank you, Patrícia, so much for your quite, anthropological take here. How do we understand difference, right? How do we understand difference? How do we listen? And how do we not assume that we know the other, right? Even though if we profoundly disagree. And how do we learn to disentangle, the values, the aspirations people have, the precarities that they experience from the way those are mobilized by that complex ecology and politics of disinformation, right? So, Brian.
I started following Brazil about 20 years ago, but it was in 2010 that I moved there to work as a reporter at the time. And I was there for 5 years, but which is to say, I got there, I arrived during the final 6 months of Lula's first presidency. And if there's an element of those years that I would love to see Brazil recapture, it's the hope and optimism that characterized those years, which, to be clear, is not the same as saying that, I was fully on board with or endorsed the political project of those years or of Lula now. But one thing that was really striking about Brazil during that era was how people believed that anything was possible. And, the circumstances are different now for all the reasons that we've been talking about. The challenges are immense in terms of the global economy and the domestic politics and so on. But, I think the opportunities are there too, as we've also discussed. So, I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic at this stage. I think I have more questions certainly than answers. But what I want is, I think what everybody wants is for the optimism and sense of progress of those years to come back. So I wish this incoming government and everybody, all Brazilians, good luck as they try to recapture at least some of the magic of that period.
Well, thank you so much, Ilona, Patrícia, and Brian, and thank you for landing our conversation there, in this sense of what might be possible, or as Ilona mentioned, a right to the future, right? But this sense of a certain effervescence, that comes through this commitment to addressing the core issues like of inequality, of the environment, right? And of a good living, of a good, access to work, access to education, to health, right? To respect, right? That I think that we had glimpses of that, in the early Lula administration, and that was guiding somehow some policies, but also was guiding also people's mobilization towards that project, right? So we learned so much from you all. We are fans of the works you individually do, but we greatly support, the ideas, values, and commitments that you sponsor, that you work towards. So we look forward to keep engaging with you and your works and bringing you back to Brazil Lab online or in person. And please count on us for the project that you are undertaking. We want to be this platform, this forum to think along that register that we ended the conversation with, or what's to come, what's yet to come. So for our viewers, thank you so much for watching. We hope you will be here with us for our upcoming Brazil Lab events. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay tuned. And you can also find us on Twitter and Instagram. So again, thank you, Patrícia, Brian, Ilona. Thank you all for joining us. Stay well and see you all soon.